The night air over Stoughton, Massachusetts, often carried the smell of rain and damp pavement. For Sandra Birchmore, the quiet suburb was a small-town cocoon that sometimes felt too tight, like the walls of her own life were pressing inward. She lived in an apartment filled with tiny pieces of her story: a framed photo of her mother on the nightstand, faded hospital bracelets tucked in a drawer, a notebook full of dreams that never made it past the page. By her early 20s, Sandra had the hopeful glow of someone who believed her next chapter would finally be brighter. She was pregnant, ready to become a mother. But long before that hope took root, there was a story of trust that had been slowly poisoned over the years, a story that began when she was still a child. Sandra was born and raised in Stoughton by her mother, Denise. Her father wasn't in the picture, and from a young age, Sandra learned what it meant to depend on herself. Denise suffered from chronic illness, the kind that came without warning and left her too weak to get out of bed. So, the responsibilities of an adult fell on a child's shoulders. Sandra learned to make simple meals, keep track of her mother's medication, and handle emergencies with the calmness of someone twice her age. Neighbors would sometimes see the young girl carrying groceries up the stairs alone, a determined look on her face. To most, she was the perfect daughter, responsible, loyal, and endlessly kind. But inside, Sandra carried a quiet loneliness that few understood. Because of her mother's health issues, the Stoughton Police Department became a familiar presence in their lives. Officers often responded to medical calls, checked in on Denise, and offered small acts of help: a ride to the hospital, a wellness visit, a friendly knock at the door to make sure everything was okay. Sandra came to see those officers as heroes. The flashing lights and calm voices that filled their apartment during emergencies made her feel safe. She trusted them. She admired them. They represented everything stable in a world that kept shifting beneath her feet. Among the officers who often crossed their path was a young patrolman named Matthew Farwell. He had joined the force a few years earlier and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who liked being looked up to. He was in his 20s, friendly, quick to joke, the kind of man who remembered your name and asked how school was going. For Sandra, who had spent so much of her life surrounded by sickness and worry, his presence was something new, a symbol of security and attention. She was 12 when their paths began to cross more often, and to her, he wasn't just another officer. He was someone who made her feel seen. Around that time, Sandra joined the Stoughton Police Explorers program, a community initiative that connected local kids with officers who taught them about safety, teamwork, and communication. For a girl like Sandra, it was a dream. The Explorers met weekly at the station, where they practiced mock traffic stops, learned about emergency response, and heard lessons about leadership and self-discipline. Sandra loved it. She wore the Explorers' uniform with pride, eager to impress the adults around her, especially Officer Farwell, who helped lead the sessions. He had once been an explorer himself and knew how to inspire the kids who looked up to him. He often singled Sandra out, telling her she had great instincts, that she was smart, and that she could go far if she stayed focused. It was harmless praise, or at least that's how it looked. For a 12-year-old girl who rarely heard words of encouragement at home, those moments meant everything. Her mother was sick. Her world was small, and here was a man in uniform telling her she mattered. What she didn't see then, what no one around her saw, was that he was planting seeds of control disguised as mentorship. He learned her routines, her family situation, her insecurities. When she smiled, he smiled back. When she asked questions, he answered in ways that made her feel special. And little by little, the line between mentor and manipulator began to blur. As months passed, Farwell began communicating with Sandra outside the program. It started innocently, with Facebook messages about upcoming Explorer events or advice about school. But soon, the tone changed. He told her she was mature for her age. He complimented her photos. He said she could talk to him about anything, even things she couldn't tell her friends. For a lonely girl desperate for guidance and belonging, those words built a bond that felt unbreakable. He became the person she turned to for validation. He was the adult who listened when others brushed her off. And because he was a police officer, someone sworn to protect, she never thought to question his intentions. At first, their meetings were always public at the station during explorer events or in group settings. But eventually, Farwell began suggesting they spend time alone. He told her he could help her study, that he could teach her things about police work she couldn't learn in class. He made it sound professional, like he was investing in her future. When he picked her up for their so-called tutoring session, no one thought twice. Everyone trusted him. After all, he was an officer helping a local teen. Behind closed doors, the lessons turned darker. FBI investigators would later uncover years of messages and evidence showing how he gradually broke down her boundaries, using affection and fear to control her. It started with simple touches, then comments about her body, followed by threats disguised as care. He tracked her phone, told her who she could and couldn't talk to, and punished her when she pushed back. By the time she was 15, the relationship had turned physical. He was 27, a grown man, newly married, a respected officer. She was a child who thought love meant doing what she was told. After their first encounter, Farwell's marriage didn't stop him. In fact, it made him more secretive. To Sandra, it was confusing. He told her she was the only one who understood him, yet he went home to his wife each night. When she questioned him, he said things like, "No one can know about us," or "You ruined my life if you told anyone." He made her believe that their relationship was something sacred, something dangerous but destined. And when she showed doubt, he reminded her of his authority, the uniform, the badge, the power to decide what was right or wrong. Over time, she learned not to resist. The dynamic of teacher and student, protector and protected, had shifted into something darker. He had total control. Outside their secret world, Sandra's life began to unravel in quiet ways. In 2016, when she was 19, her mother had a stroke and passed away just days after Sandra's birthday. The loss shattered her. Only a month later, her grandmother, the person she considered her best friend, died too. Within weeks, the two people who had grounded her were gone. Sandra spiraled into grief, clinging to the only constant left, Matthew Farwell. He comforted her at first, telling her he was there for her, but comfort soon turned into dependency. She believed he was the only person who truly cared whether she lived or died. What she didn't see was that he had isolated her completely. By her early 20s, Sandra was still living in Stoughton, working at an elementary school, and trying to rebuild a life after so much loss. She was known by her coworkers as kind, soft-spoken, and always willing to help. Children adored her. To her friends, she was the girl who'd been through too much but still smiled. No one could have guessed that, behind that smile, she was still entangled in a relationship with the same man who had first met her as a child. Farwell's control didn't lessen as she got older. It deepened. The FBI would later describe their relationship as nearly a decade of grooming, years of emotional manipulation, psychological abuse, and sexual violence. He would punish her with violent acts and then apologize, convincing her it was her fault for making him angry. He made her role-play being a victim, blending fantasy and cruelty in ways that left her trapped between fear and devotion. Sometimes he'd disappear for days, ignoring her messages, only to return with excuses that kept her clinging tighter. She'd tell friends he was her boyfriend, but she always spoke about him in half-truths, protecting the image she still wanted to believe in. By 2020, the world had slowed down due to the pandemic, and Sandra spent more time alone than ever. Her contact with Farwell continued mostly through messages, coded texts, late-night calls, the kind of communication that thrives in secrecy. Around that time, she learned that Farwell's wife was pregnant with their third child. The news broke her heart. For years, he had promised her things, a future, a life together, and each promise dissolved into another lie. But instead of walking away, she tried to hold on tighter, convinced that love could somehow fix what abuse had broken. In late 2020, she made a decision that changed everything. She told Farwell she wanted to have a baby, his baby. According to messages later uncovered by investigators, she offered him a deal. If he agreed, she'd keep their affair and his crimes a secret. For her, the offer was emotional. She wanted a family, a piece of him that no one could take away. For him, it was a threat. In December of that year, she told him she was pregnant. He didn't react with joy. He was angry. He denied responsibility. He told her to get rid of it. Friends would later say she was devastated but still hopeful. She thought maybe he'd come around, that maybe this was the moment he'd choose her. Her friends noticed a shift in her energy. She was glowing again, excited about her future. One close friend recalled that Sandra planned to announce her pregnancy on Valentine's Day. She even talked about baby names. She was over the moon, the friend said later. She thought it was her fresh start. What Sandra didn't realize was that the man she trusted for over a decade wasn't planning to start a new life with her. He was planning to end hers. By January 2021, messages between them had grown tense. Farwell was becoming distant, worried about his wife, his job, and the potential fallout if Sandra told anyone. To him, she was no longer the girl he could control. She was a liability. To Sandra, he was still the man she loved, even if he no longer treated her like someone worth saving. The weeks leading up to her death were filled with confusion, pleading, and false reassurances. Her coworkers noticed she seemed distracted. Her friends said she talked about wanting to make things right, but she never said she was scared. Maybe she didn't want to believe he was capable of hurting her. On February 1, 2021, the lights in her apartment glowed softly through the window. Her phone records would later show her final messages, short, hesitant exchanges that stopped abruptly around 9 p.m. by February 4. When she failed to show up for work at East Elementary School, her coworkers grew worried. They called the police to check on her. When officers entered her apartment, they found her on the floor, a luggage strap tied around her neck, the other end looped around the closet doorknob. She was just 23 years old and a few months pregnant. The scene was ruled a suicide. For the Stoughton Police Department, it was another tragic loss in a community that had already seen too many. But for those who knew her best, the explanation didn't make sense. Sandra had been excited about her baby. She had plans. She'd been talking about paint colors for the nursery and names she liked for a girl. None of it fit with the image of someone ready to end her life. Her family demanded answers, but the case closed quietly. And in the silence that followed, one question hung in the air: how could a girl who trusted the badge end up dead by the hands of the man who wore it? The news of Sandra Birchmore's death spread through Stoughton like a cold wind. The police called it a suicide. The department issued a brief statement offering condolences, and that was it. No further explanation, no signs of an ongoing investigation. To the town, it was a tragedy. To those who knew Sandra best, it was unthinkable. Her friends couldn't accept it. Not the idea that the woman who'd spent the last few weeks glowing with excitement about her pregnancy would suddenly end her own life. Something was wrong. At her small memorial, people brought candles, flowers, and framed photos of Sandra smiling with friends or holding children from the elementary school where she worked. Her coworkers cried as they shared memories of how she always volunteered to help. Her friend Barbara Wright stood near the back, quietly watching as police officers filed past. She noticed one face missing: Matthew Farwell. He didn't come to the service. He didn't call the family. He didn't send flowers. For someone who had supposedly cared so deeply about Sandra, his absence said everything. Barbara couldn't let it go. In the weeks after Sandra's death, she began to dig. She went through messages, photos, and posts, trying to piece together the parts of Sandra's life that had never made sense. The name Matt appeared in her conversations often, sometimes with affection, sometimes in frustration, but always with a kind of desperate attachment. Barbara hadn't known who Matt was at first, but when she realized he was an officer from the Stoughton Police Department, her confusion turned into anger. Why would a man like that be involved in her friend's life? Sandra's family, still shattered by grief, also refused to believe she'd died by suicide. Her Aunt Kelly told anyone who would listen that Sandra had plans, that she was happy about becoming a mother. She was strong, she said. She'd been through too much to give up now. But the police weren't listening. The case was closed. The autopsy confirmed suicide. There were no visible defensive wounds, no sign of a struggle, at least not one anyone was willing to look for. In those early months of 2021, whispers began to spread through the community. People who had known Sandra through the Police Explorers program remembered how close she'd been with Officer Farwell. Some said they'd always thought it was strange, the long talks, the extra attention, the way he'd drive her home alone after meetings. But no one had said anything back then. He was an officer. Who were they to question him? By summer, her friends decided they couldn't wait for the police to act. They reached out to outside investigators, journalists, anyone who would take their concerns seriously. It was Barbara Wright who finally managed to get the attention of the FBI. She told them everything she knew, the years of communication, the pregnancy, the suspicious behavior. The FBI opened a quiet review, pulling Sandra's phone records, social media messages, and digital backups. What they found painted a devastating picture of grooming, coercion, and violence that had begun when Sandra was still a child. The texts stretched back nearly a decade. They were filled with pet names, threats, demands, and disturbing fantasies. There were messages where Farwell described what he wanted to do to her in explicit detail, and others where Sandra apologized for making him angry, as if every act of abuse were her fault. Investigators saw how he had tracked her movements, how he'd made her send proof of where she was, how he'd punished her with silence when she disobeyed him. In one of the final message threads, dated just weeks before her death, Sandra told him she was pregnant. His responses were cold and panicked. He told her to get rid of it. He said she was ruining his life. And when she insisted that she wanted to keep the baby, he stopped responding altogether. The last message she ever sent him, on the night of February 1, read something short and heartbreaking, a single line that investigators would later describe as her attempt at reconciliation. He never replied. When the FBI brought their findings to state authorities, Stoughton police were forced to confront a truth they'd long ignored. Not only had one of their own officers maintained an illegal relationship with a minor, but there were also signs that others in the department might have known or even participated in similar misconduct. The town that had always trusted its police now found itself under the shadow of scandal. As agents began interviewing people connected to the Explorers program, a pattern emerged. Several young women described inappropriate behavior from multiple officers, including Matthew Farwell's brother, William, and the department's former deputy chief, Robert Devine. The internal investigation that followed confirmed that at least some of the allegations were true. William admitted to having sex with Sandra when she was an adult, though he denied anything before that. Devine, meanwhile, denied all wrongdoing. Still, the evidence of predatory behavior was impossible to ignore. By late 2023, the story began to attract media attention. Local papers published features about Sandra's mysterious death, questioning why the case had been closed so quickly. The FBI continued to collect evidence, piecing together a timeline that revealed a chilling reality. Sandra had not died by suicide. She had been strangled. Digital forensics played a key role. Investigators re-examined her cell phone data and discovered inconsistencies in the time of death originally reported. Messages and location logs indicated that Sandra's phone had been active later than previously believed, during a window of time that coincided with Farwell's movements. Surveillance footage from the area showed his vehicle near her apartment complex that night, though he had told colleagues he was at home. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that her death had been staged. The luggage strap, the positioning of her body, it didn't match typical self-inflicted strangulation. The force and angle suggested manual compression first, followed by staging to mimic suicide. Forensic experts concluded that Sandra had been killed elsewhere in the room and then placed in that position afterward. In August 2024, 3.5 years after Sandra's death, federal prosecutors made the arrest. The Morning News carried his photo, Matthew Farwell, 37, former officer, father of 3, handcuffed and silent as he was led out of his home. The headline read, Stoughton police officer charged with murder in 2021 death of pregnant woman. The arrest shook the town to its core. For years, Farwell had been seen as one of the good ones, a family man, a community mentor, a public servant. Now, the truth of who he was stood in stark contrast to the badge he'd worn. The details of the indictment were horrifying. Prosecutors alleged that he had strangled Sandra to death after learning she was pregnant with his child, then staged the scene to look like a suicide. They said that when he realized he could no longer control her, he silenced her permanently. In a press conference, acting U.S. Attorney Joshua Levy said, Sandra Birchmore survived years of grooming, statutory rape, and sexual violence at the hands of Matthew Farwell. When she became a threat to his secret, he ended her life and tried to make it look like she did it herself. Farwell pleaded not guilty. His attorney claimed there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime scene that night. But investigators had something stronger: years of digital footprints, DNA traces consistent with contact shortly before her death, and testimony from people who had seen the abusive relationship unfold. The FBI described the case as one of the most disturbing examples of long-term grooming they had ever encountered. As the case moved through the courts, the public watched in disbelief. Sandra's story became national news. People magazine, NBC News, and local Boston outlets all ran in-depth features about her life. The lonely child who wanted to serve her community, the teenager groomed by the very man sworn to protect her, and the young woman whose voice had been silenced just as she found hope again. Her friends began to speak publicly, determined to make sure her name wasn't lost in legal headlines. Barbara Wright told reporters that Sandra had planned to reveal her pregnancy to everyone on Valentine's Day, just 2 weeks after she died. She was so excited, Barbara said through tears. She was making plans. She was going to be a mom. That's not someone who's ready to give up. The revelations about the Stoughton Police Department only deepened the community's outrage. The Internal Affairs report revealed a culture of silence: senior officers who ignored rumors, inappropriate messages that went unreported, and a pattern of mentorship programs used as access points for exploitation. Many residents began questioning how such behavior could have continued for years without consequences. Farwell's brother, William, faced scrutiny too. Though not charged in Sandra's death, his admissions about his relationship with her as an adult raised questions about what he knew earlier. Deputy Chief Devine retired quietly amid the investigation, maintaining his innocence but facing public backlash. The department, once trusted by families like the Birchmores, became a symbol of betrayal. For Sandra's relatives, the legal process was both a relief and a reopening of wounds. Every detail of her life, every private message, every heartbreak was dissected in court documents. They learned that the man who had taken her life had been part of their world since she was a little girl, a guest in their home, a trusted figure who had been there during her mother's illness. He was supposed to protect her, her aunt said. Instead, he hunted her. The FBI's case laid out a chilling narrative. They described how Farwell's control over Sandra began with mentorship, escalated to abuse, and ultimately ended in murder. They found messages from him ordering her to perform acts of obedience, tracking software used to monitor her phone, and even threats about what would happen if she ever exposed him. Investigators believed that when she told him she was pregnant, he saw it as the end of his double life. If she went public, he'd lose everything: his career, his marriage, his reputation. And so, prosecutors argued, he decided to eliminate the risk. By the end of 2024, the case became one of the most followed true crime stories in New England. Documentaries began production. Reporters interviewed former explorers who described similar experiences of inappropriate behavior by officers. The town of Stoughton tried to move on, but the trust between the community and the police was shattered. Amid the public outrage, Sandra's friends focused on honoring her memory. They organized vigils and launched a foundation in her name to help victims of grooming and coercive control. Sandra's story isn't just about one bad cop, Barbara Wright said. "It's about all the girls who trust someone in power and pay the price for it." Even as the legal proceedings dragged on, Farwell remained behind bars, awaiting trial. His wife, who had given birth just hours after Sandra's death, filed for divorce. The timing added another cruel layer to the story. The day he allegedly killed Sandra, his wife had been in the hospital preparing to welcome a new life. It was as if two worlds, one of innocence, one of violence, had collided in the same moment. For investigators, the hardest part wasn't just proving how she died, but explaining why it had taken so long for anyone to see what was happening. The system that was supposed to protect girls like Sandra had failed her at every step, from the Explorers program that gave predators access, to the department that dismissed suspicions, to the early investigation that refused to look past a convenient narrative. By the winter of 2025, nearly 4 years after Sandra's death, the town of Stoughton had changed. The police department was under federal supervision, and several officers had been dismissed or reassigned. The Explorers program was permanently shut down. For many residents, these changes were long overdue. But for Sandra's loved ones, no reform could bring her back. At her gravesite, surrounded by snow-dusted trees, visitors still left flowers and small notes. One of them, written in careful cursive, read, "You trusted the badge, we won't forget." The weeks following Sandra's funeral blurred together in a fog of disbelief and quiet fury. The Stoughton community, small, close-knit, the kind of place where rumors travel faster than facts, whispered constantly. Some said Sandra had been unstable, that she was obsessed with Farwell and couldn't handle rejection. Others said the police knew more than they were admitting. Behind closed doors, her family tried to make sense of what had happened. Denise's siblings pored over old messages and journal entries, searching for proof of what Sandra had endured. They found dozens of conversations, saved screenshots, and even handwritten notes, messages that revealed years of emotional manipulation and control. One line stood out among the rest. "You're the only one I trust, the only one who ever believed in me." Those words, written to Matthew Farwell when Sandra was only 16, were more than teenage infatuation. They were a record of grooming. Investigators from the state police and the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office began retracing the connection between Sandra and the Stoughton officers she'd grown up around. It didn't take long to uncover that Farwell wasn't the only one in contact with her. 2 other officers, both much older, both sworn to protect, had maintained friendships with her that blurred professional boundaries. When questioned, the officers insisted that nothing illegal had happened, that Sandra had been an adult making her own choices. But the tone of their text messages told a different story. They were controlling, flirtatious, and sometimes cruel, a pattern that painted Sandra not as a willing participant, but as a victim surrounded by men who wielded authority like a weapon. Farwell, meanwhile, resigned from the department shortly after Sandra's death. Officially, it was a personal decision. Unofficially, it was an escape from growing scrutiny. When journalists tried to contact him, he stayed silent. His social media accounts went dark. He vanished from public life, the same way he had quietly disappeared from Sandra's when he decided she was no longer useful to him. In early 2022, a grand jury began reviewing evidence related to the Stoughton Police Department's internal conduct. Whispers of misconduct spread through the station like wildfire. The same officers who had once attended barbecues and holiday events with the Birchmore family were now at the center of a scandal. The department, once considered a pillar of local safety, was now synonymous with betrayal. The DA's report, when it finally came out, was damning. It confirmed years of inappropriate communication between officers and Sandra Birchmore, beginning when she was still a minor. It detailed how she had been mentored, groomed, and eventually exploited. The report described a culture of complicity, where senior officers ignored obvious red flags, where warnings were dismissed, and where the people sworn to protect had instead become predators. For the Birchmore family, It wasn't just a legal revelation, it was validation. For years, Sandra had tried to tell people what was happening. Her journal entries spoke of being stuck, of not being able to leave without losing the only people she thought cared about her. She had told friends about Farwell's mood swings, about how he could be affectionate one day and cold the next. Yet no one intervened. She kept saying she didn't want to get anyone in trouble, one friend later told reporters. She just wanted them to stop. As public attention grew, so did outrage. News outlets across Massachusetts began publishing stories with Sandra's photo, a smiling young woman in a bright red sweater, her eyes filled with life. The headlines were haunting: groomed by police, pregnant and alone, found dead at 23. For many, Sandra became a symbol of what happens when power is left unchecked. Activists demanded accountability. The state's attorney general called for an overhaul of how police departments handle youth programs. The Explorers Initiative, once a point of civic pride, was quietly suspended in Stoughton. At vigils, candles flickered beneath photos of Sandra as a teenager. People spoke about how gentle she was, how much she loved animals, how she had once dreamed of becoming a social worker. Those who knew her best said she believed in the goodness of others, even when that belief was used against her. Her family established a small foundation in her name, dedicated to protecting at-risk youth from predatory authority figures. They vowed that her story would not be forgotten. But perhaps the most haunting element of Sandra's story lies not just in what happened to her, but in how many people could have stopped it and didn't. Teachers saw her showing up to school in police gear, wearing gifts from officers twice her age. Neighbors noticed patrol cars parked outside her home late at night. Even fellow officers had whispered that the friendship between Farwell and the young girl seemed off. Yet silence prevailed. The system that should have protected her failed at every level.